Cars 3 is Pixar's latest film, as well as being the third installment in the Cars trilogy. It's directed by Brian Fee and stars Owen Wilson. The film once again focuses on Lightning McQueen, and fortunately this time Lightning's actually the main character, so Mater is seriously pushed to the sideline in this movie. And in my opinion, that's a good thing. This movie definitely has a much heavier focus on Lightning and his passion for racing as a sport, but as he's enjoying this sport, he realizes that he's slowly being overtaken by this new generation of higher tech, faster cars, and among each race there are more and more added to the track, to the point where he's now pretty much the slowest vehicle on the track. There is one particular vehicle that's really getting on Lightning's nerves named Jackson Storm, who is coming first every single time. And in one particular race, he overexerts himself in a desperate attempt to try and beat him, and he ends up in an extremely brutal and fatal crash. And as he recovers, he's forced to do different kinds of training in order to stay in the sport that he loves. Now, this is one of the few movies that have come out this year so far where my impressions on it was kind of in the minority. A lot of people saw Cars 3 and they just rolled their eyes at the idea, thinking it's just a pathetic, unnecessary sequel that doesn't need to exist. And a lot of people went in pretty skeptical and came out saying that it was fine. It was better than Cars 2, but that wasn't saying much because a lot of people hated Cars 2. And I'm not gonna lie, at first I was in the same boat. When I found out that they were making a Cars 3, I just rolled my eyes going, really? Do we have to see another one? But then the trailer's released, and I was instantly hooked. And there's actually another reason why I was so excited to see Cars 3. As a child, I absolutely adored the first Cars movie, and I'm not entirely too sure what it was I loved about it so much as a kid. I think it was a combination of the fact that I really loved the characters, and I also really loved the racing aspect, and as a kid, I was obsessed with racing cars, and a lot of it really came from the first Cars movie. Cars is my definitive childhood movie. I loved Lightning McQueen, I loved all the racing sequences, and I cannot tell you how much Cars merchandise I ended up getting as a kid. For the longest time as a child, Cars was my favorite movie, but I'm not entirely too sure why. It wasn't until I developed more critical thinking skills and I was exposed to movies like Inside Out or Terminator 2 Judgment Day when I stopped calling it my favorite movie. So in that kind of circumstance, I think the first Cars movie will always have a special place in my heart. Cars 2 is slightly different. It's a movie I just blindly loved as a little kid, mainly just because I loved the first movie so much, and at the time, you could have done anything with it and I still would have loved it. And now looking at it through the eyes of a teenager, I don't think it's anywhere near as good as I thought it was as a kid, and I admit that it is a very flawed movie and one of Pixar's weaker films. But I also admit that Cars 2 is nowhere close to deserving the hate it gets. I admit it has some really serious problems, and it's pretty low on my rankings of my list of how I'd rank the Pixar movies. But I still think it's a good movie. It's just that a lot of Pixar's work are great movies compared to a good movie. But Cars 3 looks like it was going to follow a lot of the things I loved about the first movie as a child, which was the main reason why I was so excited to see it. So, how do I feel about Cars 3? A lot of people came out of the movie saying it was fine, and I walked out of the movie loving it. And now I currently have to say that I really thoroughly enjoyed this film. When I was there watching it in cinemas, I would be lying if I said that I wasn't thoroughly entertained by it. I don't think it's as good as the first one, but I do agree that it is miles better than the second one. For starters, I think Cars 3 is a really well done coming of age story, and this is by far the most mature and most character-driven movie in the entire trilogy. One common criticism I've heard for this film is the fact that apparently it has very similar plots to Rocky IV and Creed and other Rocky films, and I can't confirm nor deny that because I have not seen them. But I personally thought the stories were really well done, and I have a feeling I probably would notice the similarities had I seen the Rocky movies for myself, but I haven't, so I'm not going to compare them. And one thing that really surprised me is this movie's incredible sense of humor. I wouldn't call this the best Cars movie in the trilogy, but I would definitely say it is the funniest of the trilogy. I wouldn't call it the funniest Pixar movie ever, but if you're looking for a good animated movie to have a good laugh at, then this is definitely a great movie to check out. And the racing sequences are incredibly fun to watch, as well as the stuff with the training. They're thoroughly entertaining, as well as where a lot of the good humor comes in. One thing I definitely have noticed is that this movie is a lot more connected to the first Cars movie than the second one. In fact, it doesn't even feel like the third movie is even canon to the second movie. You can tell watching Cars 3 that Pixar was doing everything they could to pretty much forget Cars 2 even happened. And Cars 3 felt like a stronger, more direct sequel to the first movie than Cars 2 did. All the stuff with the spies, gone. There's no gadgets or anything, and it's just a movie about traditional racing. Another reason why I felt like Cars 3 was a more direct sequel to the original Cars than the second movie was really because of the fact that there's a lot of characters in the first movie that disappear in the second movie that reappear in this movie, whether they play large roles or just simply as cameos. I felt like it would tell a more interesting, coherent story watching Cars and Cars 3 back to back than it would watching Cars and Cars 2 back to back. So I think Cars 3 did a better job at continuing the story than the second movie did. And looking onto the characters, one thing I really appreciate about this movie is that, again, it's a much more character-driven film. And then there's one of my favorite characters in the trilogy, Cruz Ramirez. I loved this character. In the trailers, she just appeared to be this typical character who's going to help Lightning get back to his feet. However, watching the movie, I forgot that it was a Pixar movie and there was a lot more depth put into her character. Where the characters falter for me for a little bit are the villains. Now, there's two villains in this movie. Sort of. Not exactly. Not really. There's another character I won't really talk about much for spoiler reasons, but there is one character in the trailers that's been spotlighted as the villain of the movie, Jackson Storm. And he is incredibly one-dimensional. He's just a typical guy who's just really cocky going, yeah, I'm now the new guy and I'm so happy to beat you, so yeah, eat my dust. He doesn't get too much screen time in the film, but it's pretty disappointing to see this character being so one-dimensional. I mean, I don't really know anything about him. I don't really know who he is, what his likes and dislikes are, or his backstory or anything. He's just there. Chick Hicks was also a pretty undeveloped villain in the first movie. However, the reason why I felt like Chick worked a lot better in the first movie is because Chick, while he wasn't there in the movie very much, he still had a really big standout personality. He was very cocky and he was actually somewhat funny, and his personality had a much more lasting impression. Considering it's a Pixar film, it's pretty much a default to say this, but the animation is gorgeous in this movie. It looks amazing. There's just a lot of really great nice touches, like a lot of the effects, the really excellent lighting, and while there's a lot of tweaks that are extremely subtle, you can tell that looking at the footage of the first movie and Cars 3 back to back, that after 11 years, their animation has really evolved. I still think that the animation for Cars is still really good, but Cars 3 looks miles better. This is a fantastic looking movie. And having that said though, Cars 3 does have quite a few problems. Aside from the villains being pretty lackluster, the movie is probably going to anger a lot of racing car fans, and that's because there's a lot of rules about racing that are pretty much thrown out the window. Like pretty much the movie's entire premise. It's getting to the point where Lightning McQueen's the slowest vehicle on the track, and so there's almost no way he could win the race. In actuality, this is something that would never happen because every single car on the track is specifically designed to match around similar speeds, and so to win isn't depending on how fast you're driving, but how well you drive. So in the real world, how you win a race is all about strategy. Because in real life, having one car significantly faster than all of the others is extremely unfair. And there's another rule that's completely thrown out the window, which I won't really get into because it's a spoiler, but there's something that happens during the end of this movie where characters are going, wait, can they even do that? And the audience is having the same reaction, and it's quite a bit of a stretch. It works on an emotional level, but at the same time, you really have to suspend your disbelief with what they're doing. You would know what I mean if you've seen the movie yourself. Also, other little minor things that kind of bother me are things like the crash. The crash was the huge selling point of this movie. There were wallpapers, it was the poster of the movie, and it was the big epic trailer that got everyone gasping and going, what the hell did we just watch? And the one thing that had pretty much everybody, including skeptics, interested in seeing the movie. And while I will say that the crash is just as brutal in the actual movie as it is in the trailers, but it's not as impactful as it was in the trailer. It may have helped that we actually see it coming, but we only see the crash once, and it's the one that we're seeing at night. I was really interested in seeing how the version we see that's ultra realistic. It has a cinematography of an MCU movie, and it has a really great dull photorealistic feel to it, which is where the crash looks the most brutal. I was really looking forward to seeing how that would play out in the actual film. I was expecting it to be some sort of dream sequence or flashback or something, because that crash was so brutal it would haunt Lightning for the rest of the film. And it doesn't. So the footage that you're seeing right now, this is not in the movie. The version we see at night is, but the footage we see in the original first teaser trailer, the one that got everyone's attention, this is footage that was changed, like the lighting and everything is all changed and everything, but the footage we're actually seeing isn't in the final cut of the movie at all. The crash doesn't really impact the plot that much. In fact, about 10 minutes after the crash happens, it almost feels like that Lightning McQueen completely has forgotten about the crash. In fact, you could pretty much take the crash out of the movie and it really wouldn't affect the story that much. You could just simply have the movie about Lightning McQueen trying to beat Jackson Storm throughout the entire movie. And so I'm really disappointed that the crash, the big selling point of the movie, is almost kind of meaningless. There are also some other little bits of missed potential I felt like the movie had. For example, the way the trailers were edited, I was expecting there to be a bunch of short 3-minute racing sequences dropped and sprinkled throughout the movie. So the big crash would happen at the end of the season, and then the bulk of the movie would be another season, with Lightning McQueen training with Cruz Ramirez, and is gradually learning little tips and tricks on how to beat Jackson Storm. And since it would have been in a gradual progression, I think that would have made the movie a little bit stronger. But in this movie, we just simply have a bunch of little racing bits in one big montage in the beginning of the film, and then we don't see another true racing sequence until the end of the film. And my last little minor complaint I have about the film is the fact that I don't think it's really as emotional as it's trying to be. It tries to really get you in the feels and tries to have some really great emotional scenes that the first two movies lacked, including the first one. And there are scenes where it really felt like it was trying, but it really wasn't as impactful as it was trying to be. I was definitely emotionally invested, but I just really wasn't feeling it. But despite its flaws, I still really enjoyed this movie. But how much I would recommend it to you really entirely depends on how you feel about the first movie. If you're a fan of racing or you love the first movie, then I definitely recommend it because it's around on par and around the same levels as the first movie. But if you thought the first movie was just fine or less, then maybe give this movie a skip. But if you liked the first movie or loved the first movie, I definitely recommend checking it out. I thought it was thoroughly entertaining and I'm really glad I saw it in cinemas. I'm going to give Cars 3 a B. Well, thank you all for watching. I hope you all enjoyed. Stay tuned for my next review. But until then, yippee-ki-yay, movie lovers.